Senator Elizabeth Warren has dropped out of the presidential race. The move follows her poor performance on Super Tuesday, including placing third in her home state of Massachusetts. Warren struggled to regain momentum she had just months ago. Her departure from the Democratic field clears the way for a race between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Here's what she said earlier when asked if she'd be endorsing another candidate.
Not today. Not today. I need some space around this and want to take a little time to think a little more. I was told at the beginning of this whole undertaking that there are two lanes. A progressive lane that Bernie Sanders is the incumbent for and a moderate lane that Joe Biden is the incumbent for. And there's no room for anyone else in this. I thought that wasn't right, but evidently I was wrong.
Let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns, Sean Sullivan, and Kat Safford. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. Sean is CBSN political contributor and national politics reporter for The Washington Post. And Kat is a race and ethnicity writer for The Associated Press. Thank you all for joining us. Caitlin, first of all, nice to see you back here at the ranch. I know you were out on the campaign trail for quite a while.
Good to see you.
What are you learning about Elizabeth Warren's decision to drop out?
Well, it does come after those disappointing finishes for her in those Super Tuesday states and the first four early contests, really underperforming the expectations that the campaign had set. But I thought the clip that you just played showed how candid she was in her assessment of what happened, talking to reporters there outside her home in Massachusetts earlier today, talking about how this race went. We saw Elizabeth Warren be the first top-tier candidate to announce her candidacy actually way before 2020 began. She had enjoyed a big rise over the summer. She was leading in a lot of the early polls. She had a big ground operation in a lot of these states and really kind of fell after a series of events. But I think what she was saying there, I think, will be something that is analyzed throughout the course of this race.
It's so striking to me, Caitlin, how in the hours, days after a candidate drops out, you see this very human side as they sort of let their guard down. I think, we certainly saw that with her. We saw it with Mike Bloomberg. You see perhaps a side that they weren't able or comfortable showing during their actual run.
Right. I think that was a really remarkable statement that she made, and she talked about gender, which I know we'll talk about as well. But I think this also comes as the field has narrowed down to two candidates, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And I think what we saw over the past week, this coalescing around Joe Biden from the non-Bernie Sanders campaign, really signaled to these other candidates without a clear path that it was time to make a decision.
So, Sean, Warren said today she needs more time to think about any possible endorsement. But Senator Sanders said today he wants her endorsement. Let's listen to some of that.
I would love to have her disappointment, but today what I'm doing is reaching out to the millions of strong supporters that she had and to tell them that, while Senator Warren and I had nuances of differences, we did, that there is no question that her agenda, what she fought for in the campaign, was far closer to what I am fighting for than what Joe Biden believes in.
So CBS News spoke with Sanders' team, who clarified he misspoke there, meant to say endorsement. But, Sean, is there any indication of whether Warren would endorse Sanders or Biden?
Not yet, and it is a dilemma for her when you look at this race. Ideologically, she certainly is closer to Senator Sanders in terms of their views on health care, in terms of their views on trade, in terms of their views on a whole host of issues. But of course, when candidates make these decisions about whether they should or should not endorse their rivals, it's oftentimes more than just a policy-related decision. And of course, earlier this year, there was, sort of a personal standoff between Senator Warren and Senator Sanders over a private conversation they had. And there's been a lot of tension between supporters of Warren, supporters of Sanders. A lot of Warren supporters feel like Sanders supporters have attacked them online, have attacked their candidate online too aggressively. So there are a lot of hard feelings in this situation, and it's not really clear yet where Senator Warren is going to land. It's clear that Senator Sanders wants her, especially at a moment, wants her endorsement, especially at a moment when Biden is now sort of coalescing the rest of the party. Sanders is trying to demonstrate and show to the party, hey, I'm somebody who can bring in new parts of the Democratic coalition into my tent at a time when Biden, you know, day after day is just picking up more and more endorsements from members of Congress, from other local officials. Sanders is not doing that right now. And so if he were to get her endorsement, it would be a big thing. But I think at this point, Senator Warren is signaling she's not ready to make a decision on this anytime soon.
Well, Caitlin, Joe Biden was interviewed on NBC earlier where he was asked about Sanders saying he's running a campaign with the support of the establishment. Let's listen to his response.
Let's talk about Mr. Sanders. He has been talking about your victory. He said Joe is running a campaign which is obviously heavily supported by the corporate establishment. What do you think about that argument?
It's ridiculous. Is ridiculous. Bernie, you got beaten by overwhelming support I have from the African-American community, Bernie. You got beaten because of suburban women, Bernie. You got beaten because of middle-class, hardworking folks out there, Bernie.
So, Caitlin, is this the type of rhetoric we can expect to see in that campaign from now on?
I think so. I think the Biden campaign is trying to make the point, as the issue of electability hangs over all of this, that the Biden campaign has proven in the Super Tuesday victories that he is able to garner a wide, broad coalition, that as Bernie Sanders campaigned about increasing voter turnout, it was actually states that had increased voter turnout that Joe Biden won. And he won by targeting those same types of voters that Democrats targeted in the 2018 midterms. Women in the suburbs, college educated. That's where Joe Biden has been doing well. That's where we may see some overlap, actually, in Warren supporters and Joe Biden supporters. So something to look forward or look at in the coming days as well as she makes that decision. I think it also speaks to the way in which this really has narrowed down to two very different visions for the party. Bernie Sanders campaigning to shake things up and go a different route and going after Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, who has always been campaigning as kind of just getting things back to what he says is normal before the days of Donald Trump. And it seems like, given those Super Tuesday victories and some surprise finishes for Biden, that is something, and looking at the exit polling of what voters have been saying that they want, that's something that's favoring Biden.
Well, Kat, we just heard Biden tout his support in the African-American community as a main part of the coalition he is building. And your latest piece says, quote, Black voters power Joe Biden's Super Tuesday success. Does the primary schedule in the next few weeks point to the same kind of success for Biden?
That's an interesting question. So what we saw this past Tuesday was really African-American voters coming out in their communities, showing up at the polls and overwhelmingly supporting Joe Biden. And for many reporters who are on the ground in these communities, we have been seeing this sort of support bubbling up, especially since South Carolina. A lot of the voters that I spoke with and interviewed, they said that they were supporting Biden because he knows them. They know him. They know his record. And one very interesting thing that was in that story, one person I spoke with, she said, look, Black voters are not just pragmatic. They're strategic. They are strategically deciding to support Biden. So as we look forward to next week, as we look forward to the primaries happening in states like Michigan and Mississippi, which also have a large and significant amount of Black voters, it's very possible that we could continue to see the same momentum for Joe Biden. But what's also interesting is that AP voter cast surveys found that Sanders also does seem to have a good amount of support among younger voters. So if those voters do show up and out at the polls like we saw in other states like California, the race could get really interesting.
And let's talk a little bit more about that Black support in Michigan. How does that factor into the primary? You talked a little bit about Sanders appealing to younger voters, but in and around the Detroit area, of course, the Black vote is going to be critical.
The Black vote is critical. You are correct. And just like we've seen in other cities across the country, in Detroit, a significant amount of that voter population is older. which is what we saw in Texas, what we saw in Virginia, and Alabama as well. So we will likely, it's going to be interesting if we see those voters come out to the polls and continue this trend of supporting Joe Biden. And what really seemed to bolster him over the course of just these past few days is when he got that endorsement from Clyburn. A lot of the people that I spoke with on the trail, they said once they heard that he got this endorsement, for them that was firm for what they wanted to do, because they respect Clyburn. He's a very respected person in the African American community. So when you're talking about a city like Detroit that has an older population, we could see that. But again, it will be interesting to see if younger African Americans show up at the polls and throw their support behind Sanders.
Well, Caitlin, at Elizabeth Warren's press conference earlier, she was asked about the role that gender played in the race. You mentioned this earlier. Let's go ahead and listen to what she had to say.
Gender in this race, that is the trap question for every woman. If you say, yeah, there was sexism in this race, everyone says whiner. And if you say, no, there was no sexism, about a bazillion women think, what planet do you live on?
So, Caitlin, this is so interesting because when you talk to our CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, he will tell you that this issue is particularly difficult to get your arms around as someone whose job it is to survey what people really believe. No one wants to tell a pollster that there's, that they have reservations about a certain type of person occupying that very top office. So if it's difficult to sort of even understand it, when you hear Elizabeth Warren's comments there, what do you make of that as someone who has observed her up close on the campaign trail?
Yeah, because it's so difficult to define, I think the way that she talked about this dilemma, I think, is really compelling, quite frankly. And I can speak to my reporting and the conversations that I've had with voters over and over and over again. Because electability, that really hard to define metric, has been top of mind for so many voters. I've talked to a lot of voters who do want a woman at the top of the ticket, but are concerned about the electability issue. I would hear a lot of women say that, well, I want a woman, but I don't know if a woman can actually win. Never mind that Hillary Clinton got the popular vote in 2016, but that still is, her loss in the Electoral College is still top of mind for a lot of folks. And I also think it speaks to the way in which Elizabeth Warren made having a plan for that center to her campaign. And she did come under really tough scrutiny, which she should, for her Medicare for All plan. But that same scrutiny wasn't necessarily applied across the board to some of these other candidates. And I think that when she starts to talk about this in the coming days, we'll learn a little bit more about how she's thinking about it. But I think because electability is at such a premium for these voters, that the issue of sexism is an issue in this race. And it's hard to define, but it's something that we have seen voters talk about and address on the campaign trail.
And by the way, Democrats and Republicans who are strategists have talked about this as an issue in both parties that they feel is something that they need to work on as well.
Across the board.
So, Sean, you have been reporting in the Washington Post that, quote, Bernie Sanders' political movement faces a reckoning after Super Tuesday's setbacks. Explain what this reckoning is that you're discussing here.
Well, there are a couple of things going on right now with Senator Sanders that we've seen now that we've seen a bunch of states vote, hold their primaries, hold their caucuses. And right now for Senator Sanders, the question is, has he built a coalition that is capable of winning the Democratic nomination and potentially winning the White House? And what we saw on Super Tuesday in a lot of places was that coalition fell well short of the mark. What we see with Senator Sanders is a candidate who has appealed to young voters, who has appealed to liberal voters, who has appealed to working class voters, and has appealed to Latino voters, which has helped propel him in a lot of these early states. But he's really struggled among African American voters. He's really struggled among older voters. And when it comes to young voters, he's strong, but young voters don't turn out in big numbers. And what we saw in these exit polls on Super Tuesday was that they were not turning out in big numbers. And so the theory of the case for a long time for the Sanders campaign has been, look, we're going to build this coalition that involves turning out new voters, people who haven't been interested in politics, people who haven't showed up in in primaries before, given to candidates or tuned into debates. We're going to bring these people into the process, and that's how we're going to win. That is how we're going to match the coalitions of other candidates. And it just hasn't materialized so far for the Sanders campaign. And so they have reached a moment of reckoning where they have to ask themselves, if this movement, the way that we've envisioned it, is not going to be enough to win this nomination, how then do they find ways to bring in new support from other places in the party? And it's an increasingly challenging thing for them right now, because on the other side of the equation, you have former Vice President Joe Biden, who is coalescing large parts of the Democratic Party right now, who is really, really strong with African-American voters and with older voters, and by the day is picking up endorsements left and right from key states and key officials. So he's projecting that he's a unifier, that he's somebody who can bring the party together to defeat President Trump. It can be a pretty powerful argument, as we saw on Super Tuesday. The question now for Senator Sanders is, how can he grow that coalition? Where can he find new votes? Because the ways in which they've looked for that new support, at least so far, it just hasn't materialized.
Right. Caitlin, in our final minute here, I want to ask you about Michael Bloomberg, who dropped out of the race on Wednesday. He's planning a new group to support the Democratic nominee that's committed to beating President Trump. So what could this mean for the eventual Democratic nominee?
Well, if the eventual Democratic nominee is Joe Biden, I think they would welcome that support in terms of resources. He's been a candidate who hasn't been able to raise the kind of money like Bernie Sanders has. And as Bloomberg became a polarizing figure in this race, a lot of the candidates were asked whether you would take his money, and a lot of them had issues doing so. But I think it also points to the way in which he can have an impact after this race. Now, some Democrats may have argued that he should have stuck to that position from the beginning, not entered the race himself, but supported people from the outside. But that kind of money, especially as we see how much money the RNC and Donald Trump are raising, I think Democrats will welcome this investment.
Really been some eye-popping figures so far. All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Sean Sullivan, and Kat Safford, thank you all very much.